Welcome back, and we're moving into our second conversation for today as we are joined by attorney-at-law Audrey Matura as we talk about the law on abuse in relationships. Good morning and welcome.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Good morning.
Now, Audrey, this conversation is more timely than we suspected. But in fact, you had you began to raise this particular issue in your column that you write, and it seems to be something that you have been hearing different issues and having different clients come to you looking at this specific issue. Tell me what prompted you to address it in the first place.
Well, I've always been a person for a while talking about abuse. And I know the issue not only based on my legal training, but also from personal experience. But what I began finding, like, I am trying to figure out what are some of the causes, what root causes of our social issues. And as I get to encounter the lives of other people through my work, I began realizing that, you know what? Abuse is at the core of the many things and ills we suffer in this country. And when I talk about abuse, I know I write a lot about in relationships, in marriages, in terms of the law, but there's an article I wrote about how we've developed this culture of violence and abuse in this country, and I talk about abuse from the level of the political realm because our politicians are abusive to us, and we've become accepting of it. In our society, how we treat each other on a day-to-day basis, very abusive, the language we use, sometimes the conduct we display, and then in the schools and the communities, and then that all traces back to the home. You see, you are abused at home. What are you going to be? You're a product of your home. And so then you display your personalities out in the community, in your school, in your church, amongst friends, when you go out. And then that's a larger problem for the society on a whole. And why are we accepting of even the political abuse? It's because we've become to accept from our homes that abuse is normal. So even though, like, for example, I had a post on Facebook talking about the issue of the murder-suicide. I mean, and a guy actually had the audacity to go and use obscene language, and he sees that as normal. And other people will see it as normal because that's the only way they know to express themselves, because growing up, I mean, I've seen sometimes on the street, moms just hit the kids and say, you effing this, whatever, and they call them the worst words. So what you expect them to grow up to be and to be able to express themselves. So to me, it's more than just because of my legal background, but it's to looking at it at the entire societal problem that it creates. But in my opinion, it all stems from the home.
Good.
It's interesting because, like you said, Audrey, when you raise an issue that is of serious concern to many, not only to a specific person in a circumstance, but across the board, and people respond, perhaps in this case, this individual responded the best way he knows how, but that reflects a level of ignorance and short-sightedness as to the scope of the problem. When you look at abuse, I look at things sort of from an objective perspective where it's perhaps, well, objective perspective is, that doesn't go together, but you have someone who you consider the perpetrator, right? And then you'd have someone who's considered the victim, right? But then, what if it's a situation where perhaps the chemistry, the dynamic, just isn't what it's supposed to be between, in this case, man and woman, that leads to that kind of a friction?
I think really what we need to look at in that situation is that, let's look at an adult male interacting with a female and vice versa. What you need to understand, when you get in a relationship with someone, so you and I get into a relationship, I'm getting into a relationship with you and your entire past, you know. From your childhood, how your mom raised you, how your father abandoned you, how your brothers got preference over you, how you felt that you were a black sheep, how at school you didn't succeed. I am getting into a relationship with all of that. So when I get into that relationship of all of that, what you manifest to me is all of that. It's not just what you are today. You don't become today who you are just today or yesterday or 24 hours ago. Your entire family history comes with you and vice versa with me. My entire childhood comes with me, the fact of how my father was and my mother was, my struggles and everything. Now, many people don't recognize that and consciously change that pattern. So we've come through a pattern of development throughout our lives that may be abusive, may be developmental, may be nurturing. And unfortunately, what I'm saying, in all society, most of us come from a background of abuse. Now, it's not everybody that act it out, because there's an inherent DNA personality in each of us that make us react different. You could have two siblings in the same home, and those two siblings grew up in the same situation, you would say, but each respond differently to it. And your parents respond differently. There's always that child that was rebellious, and the child that knows to, already from a young age, knows to bargain his or her way to get his way, because it's a survival mechanism. So now you get into a relationship with that person. And because that person has never had and known how to navigate a healthy relationship, that's what you're going to face. So you now marry this person, and you're living with that trauma that he or she never resolved. And so my point is that we have to recognize that from home, in most of our homes, we've suffered abuse. And so then collectively, all of our abuse becomes the collective culture of the country. And it so happened that that is made worse by the educational system where we have that doesn't teach you critical thinking. It's about rote. They drill things into you, and they don't encourage creativity. It's demerits, expulsion, and you know, we use a negative stimulus. And then we also have to look at how that same person now needs to perform in our entire society under norms that are dictated by television or status or money. And it's a lot of pressure. But until we accept that in Belize we have a culture of abuse that leads to the violence on the street, we will not address it, because all of us are in denial. And if all of us want to be honest with ourselves, reflect today. Take 5 minutes out of your time today before you fall asleep and ask yourselves, when have you been abusive to others? And we have all done it. I've done it. So I'm not even going to excuse myself. But the difference is, I have come to that place where I recognize it, and I have to work at it, and I have to be better at it. And because I'm at that place, I need to share about it, because I think I have the opportunity not only to look at it legally and getting into the private lives of people through cases to help me recognize where I'm at, but I've also been trying to get professional help, professional guidance, read professional booklets so that we can understand what is it. And that's where we are.
You know, I appreciate that as a backdrop for the conversation, because it's part of what I said earlier. We look at issues like the very tragic murder-suicide that took place this weekend, and we isolate ourselves from it. We feel we have we had no part
or it's not us or our loved ones.
In these types of actions manifesting, and we do. We always do. And so I think that's a great backdrop to start off. But obviously, the first thing people would say, there's a difference between me, who perhaps use vile language towards my partner or towards wider community, versus someone else who picks up a gun and harms another person. And so I think the resiliency issue between what some people are able to cope with versus what others are is the key difference. But I want to go back to the legal protection mechanisms that are in place. And I usually hear that the laws, when it comes to domestic violence, are more skewed towards the protection of women rather than the protection of men. Can you tell me how fair the system is?
Okay, so let us look at the law then. In terms of abuse, and in the Domestic Violence Act is referred to as domestic violence, and domestic violence then is defined as sexual violence, physical violence, emotional violence, psychological violence, and financial violence, right? So it's in that context that we need to look at it. All of us can understand sexual, physical, but we don't really understand emotional, psychological, because that one is so subtle, and it's not so much sometimes what they do to you, it's what they don't do to you. Like when a husband withdraws his affection, or a wife withdraws an affection, because couples have a tendency when they fight, oh, well, there's no intimacy. That in itself is abuse. When you withdraw from discussing things rather than discussing it and give the silent treatment, that is abuse. Financial abuse is another one that people don't really understand, but a lot of people in this country suffer that, where they, for the mere fact that you stay in a relationship, because if I leave, how will I afford to pay for these kids? Because the man or the woman, and mostly the men, tell you outright, if you want anything from me, you better carry me to court. And even when you carry me to court, I don't give as much. I will come up with all sorts of excuses. I've known cases where the men even stop working just not to be able to pay.
Or they go by the prescription of the court, and which is the bare minimum.
But that whole mentality tells you that that person is an abuser.
Yeah.
And the person on the receiving end accepting it tells you that that person also came from an abusive background, so they accept abuse as norm. So now what mechanisms are in place? Well, let me tell you, the law, the way it's written, it's equally for both men and women.
Okay.
And men and women, it's from all ages, from childhood, from birth, right up to the day you die. Even elders are abused. Older people are abused in their homes by their children or in-laws and stuff like that. So we're equal before the law in terms of our gender. But the mechanisms that are in place, in my opinion, are very lacking. For example, you can go to the family court and make a complaint, but I don't think that the people there are trained enough to understand psychological and emotional abuse. So if you go there, I'll beat up, and so immediately they help you get an interim protection order. But if you go there with a history of trauma, emotional, psychological trauma, they can't recognize it to understand that you likewise immediately need a protection order, and in some instances they tell the people, oh no, could still stay in the same house. In this instant case that happened over the weekend with the Emmanuels, let me tell you how lacking the system is. My information is that on Thursday, this couple had a confrontation. Police were involved. He was taken to the police station, temporarily held there, his weapon taken away. In that instance, the law should have already made provision where once a weapon is involved, immediately the police can call on a magistrate to give a temporary restraining order, or the police at a senior level should be able to give a restraining order. Yeah. But no, instead, they release him and give him back his gun for a crime that could have been prevented. Clearly, there's a lot to the background of that. Yes.
Just one quick question, just for me to be able to follow along clearly. The incident on Thursday, did it involve the firearm, threatening of use of the firearm, or was it,
to my information,
just on his person at the time that this incident?
To my information, it was used, and that it wasn't the first time, to my information, but I'll put a caveat immediately. I don't have that first-hand information from the police.
Understood.
This is people close to the family that have said that. But it is confirmed that police were called on Thursday.
Now, one of the things you said has really stood out at me, and that is the burden of proof when you have finally, as they say, broken the cycle and want to go to the police department to do something. Because that's what it is. It takes the psychological aspect of leaving that situation where you feel it's life or death to make that step to the police department. And then I have to prove to the police department why I need to be protected from this person. Now, you use the example of being beaten up. If you have physical wounds on you, perhaps it's easier for them to help you. But sexual violence, which is one I know a lot of people don't understand, you can be raped in a relationship by your partner, by your husband. If you say no, if you are passed out, that is rape.
Yes.
Or if they're forced you to do something you don't want to do. There is the psychological part. If they pull out the gun or just have it next to them and say, I'm going to kill you, or you will never leave me, or I will kill myself if you leave me. There is the financial abuse where I cannot obtain anything because I have no money and I am at the mercy of asking you for my basic needs. And you use that as a way to manipulate and exert power over me.
Yes.
How does a person go into the police department and prove these types? I mean, I can say he threatened, but
it's hard. And the problem that I wanted to get at is that the very people who are to provide the support lack the training, lack the understanding, and they themselves are abusers or are being abused. Could you imagine how often women call and the police come and they're men and they're like, man, oh no, I could work this out. Like, they don't give it the importance. And it's like, Belize is so small, I know the person, and you know that kind of dynamics. It's not to put the police officers down, but it's to accept the reality that many of them cannot tangibly.
You're not trained to identify the issue beyond what
and not only that, some of them are perpetrators or victims themselves. You're asking people, so I really think there needs to be a psychological profile of those who are asked to be frontliners in these kind of cases, because abuse is so ingrained in us. Think about from that childhood, just think that child in us that never got cured, that never got soothed, because we lived with abuse all our life, and we're now putting them in a position of authority. Remember, abuse is always about power and control. The abuser is always trying to exert power and control over this person, either through money, through sex, through physical violence, through verbal assault, or emotional manipulation. And so if you were a child growing up like that, and we have to admit, we are products of an era when our parents believed that the way to raise us was with a good beating and a lot of verbal abuse. So we came to accept that. Now we know that's not the way, but how do you break that chain?
That's
how you who are a product of that change. We don't want to accept that's a problem, and we see it is so intellectual, you would say, or it is so non-tangible that it's easy for our leaders to set aside. And it's easy for them to set aside because as long as we remain a traumatized, abused society, we will accept political violence and abuse. It magnifies. It starts at the home, but it then goes up to the highest level of governance and interpersonal relationship in your society.
So what is your advice to people? Somebody, and again, I go back to the breaking the cycle. And I know from past experience that those who work in the family violence unit should be trained in understanding the cycles. That if you have to go 50 times to the same home and the person goes back, the abused person goes back, the 51st time may be the time you make an impact. They should be trained to understand that. But
they become judgmental. They become,
I understand. I'm frustrated because they see somebody going back into a treacherous situation.
But some of these people are reliving their own abuse as they stand with you.
But how do I prove? What do I go? You always hear that the people say, oh, document as you go along. Some women aren't even allowed to have phones to take a picture of their bruises. So if I have no scars, nothing but my own personal testimony, what can I do to help to protect myself and get out of the situation before I lose my life?
Well, let me tell you what helps. Believe it or not, sometimes the best help comes from those people closest to you, not your family, a friend. A lot of the testimonies I've seen that people have been writing is that the person who helped them was a friend. A girlfriend or a boyfriend, and I don't mean in a sexual way.
A male friend, female friend.
A co-worker, someone, because you need support, but you cannot always remain silent. The other thing is that we are now in an era where we actually have access to counseling and therapist service that you need to be able to access, because it's not easy. There's no one easy answer, because part of it is that you have to first recognize that it's abuse. And the other part of it is that you remove yourself from the denial and are prepared to go into some mode that you actually want help. And that's the hardest part. That's why the example that you give, that you will go back 50 times, that's hard, because remember, your abuser knows to manipulate your emotions, knows to manipulate your sense of comfort, your sense of security, your sense of everything. So individually, it may be a different formula for everyone, but it all starts with you wanting to say, I really want to get out. Some people never get out, and I'm not being judgmental of them. It's just that it's not easy. I think what we need to look at, why I keep writing about this issue and talking about it openly and putting even my life story out there, not because I want people to know my entire business, but because I realize that the dialogue needs to continue. So what is one of the more collective solution? The most collective solution is for us to finally just talk about it openly.
It's still such a taboo.
It is a taboo. It's a taboo.
But we also have to identify some of the initial stages of this kind of power hungry people in relationships. I was telling Isani earlier, you know, when guys hang out and you hear your friend say, well, my woman can't do that, and my woman can't up on Facebook, and my woman wouldn't be able to do that. What do we do? What do we say?
Well, the guys in the group who have better sense should put a stop to it.
Because we don't do anything. They don't. I don't believe
but you see, the conversation needs to start.
Yeah.
We don't want to accept that we are an abusive society and that we are an abuse. We are abusive because we've been abused. It sounds very simple, but it's not that simple to say that we need to keep having the conversation because culturally, we need to get this society to accept first and foremost that we've developed a culture of abuse. And we each need to take personal responsibility. A lot of people will not take that personal responsibility because it's hard. It's very hard. It's to accept that, man, if I accept I'm an abuser, I don't even want to talk about the things that were done to me as a child. It's not everybody that is abused reflects the abuse, but the majority does. The other thing is that it can't be only people like myself talking about it. It has to be that there's an actual systematic desire of whoever's in government to be able to push the issue and talk about it beyond just having the lip service, but it means that we actually need to have our own programs in our schools. Our school is a very good breeding ground where this issue can be dealt with. Could you imagine how many children go to school having been abused at home just the night before, the morning before going to school, and not recognizing, because their little minds are not mature, not recognizing what is it that they just dealt with and starting to feel that that is the norm. And so that's how they develop. It's not going to change overnight.
If there is,
I might not even see the change I want culturally in my lifetime.
If there is any kind of social movement to come out of having this kind of a discussion, right, where you have come forward, you've shared the legal aspect of this issue, and you have shared excerpts of your personal experiences to sort of bolster the position that you've taken in speaking out. I think if there's any kind of a social movement, it should rally around the fact that here's a champion of this discussion to be held in the open. But then not to be negative or cynical, but you have people who only go with certain aspects of your experience and say, well, look, this is how I know about Audrey now. As opposed to seeing the bigger picture that says, you know what? Perhaps having lived it herself, she is now coming forth and leading the charge in terms of opening up the floor for discussion of this issue.
That what people will say and who want to attack doesn't bother me. It does not stop the movement. I am not expecting the entire change in my lifetime. If one woman comes along and I can make a difference in her life, if one child comes along and I can impact his or her life, if one male comes along and recognize it, I've succeeded. For me personally, it is something close to my heart because I recognize the abuse I grew up with. And I recognize that people will talk, but their talking doesn't stop me. What they say about me doesn't change my reality. What they say about me doesn't change my story. It's her story, not his story. What they say about me or how they conclude it is a reflection that they're battling their own demons. And I'm not there to judge them. They can judge me, but I'm beyond that. I'm at a space in my life where I'm comfortable talking about everything. And when I name the abusers, it's not because I have anything against them, it's because I've forgiven them. But I think it's important that people realize that there is a way to get out of it. Not only for yourself, for your children, for the society you live in. And if you recognize that, imagine each one of us individually that has experienced abuse, what we are individually. Imagine when we join with every other person who has suffered some form of abuse. We then become the product, we are that society. So what collectively we are an abuse society. I suspect, and these are my guesstimates, that at least 90% of our population has suffered some form of abuse. And of those, at least 70% are sexual abuse at the hands of an aunt, an uncle, a brother, a cousin, a friend, whatever.
Well, let me just say there, because I have been asking this question a long time about what type of research is being done in this country. I have the very same suspicion. I think in conversations, we hear so frequently people who have been impacted primarily by sexual abuse. We haven't moved into physical as yet, because we once believed corporal punishment was the way to raise children. I was told that there is some initial work that is starting to take place. It's not there yet, but I want to touch on the part that you share your story. You know, one of the things that we do have to recognize is that as much as we look at the Me Too movement in the United States, The only way people become empowered to be honest and speak up is when they hear others do so. When we step forward, we give others the courage to do so. So I'd like to say that that is what you do, and I suspect you did so consciously, is open the doors for others to feel more comfortable to say that they have endured similar in issues within their own life. But I wanna go further, because I feel like sometimes the campaigns in this country are so much more about lip service. You know, we're great with hashtags. I say it all the time on the show. Oh, I'm with you. We're great at, maybe some of the Facebook support. Maybe we gather together in a large group or a gathering, but really just to chastise the people who step forward rather than really be about the movement. If we were to say how some of the actions that we have, the way we discuss it, and how it can change the culture that we're seeing right now, whether it's identifying yourself as a victim of abuse, or whether it is calling out somebody who seems to be on the path of becoming an abuser or already an abuser to you.
Okay, you've said a mouthful. Let me tell you first. For me, part of my development, my personal development to deal with abuse, is to talk about it openly and not to be ashamed of it. Because I recognize I was just a child. And so I have no part in doing whatever happened to me. And I recognize that my parents did come from very abusive situations. My mom was an orphan and my father was partly orphaned and very abused. So of course they will bring on to me what they know. So they transferred their life to me, and then I became part of that feeling. I just always felt that it wasn't right. But then I have the opportunity to learn more, be more exposed, and so I have to break the cycle and talk about it. Because at one point when my kids were younger, I remember beating them too. And realizing like, this doesn't feel right. But there was a feeling, there was some kind of release. It's like, when you are doing what was done to you, there's an anger you're venting out that is misplaced. I always remember that feeling that I used to get.
A sense of misplaced aggression.
Yes, yes. And so you need to then, it's not easy to do, but you need to then realize that, look, you're just perpetuating what was done to you. It takes a lot.
And teaching them to continue.
It takes a lot to reach that person. So for me, in the personal aspect, that's it. Now, in terms of what that is supposed to do for the rest of the community, I have said I don't expect the massive change in my lifetime. However, if what I am saying today and people are hearing just sparks a conversation in a home amongst a couple, that's the start. I'm just planting the seed. Everybody else has to water it, and everybody has to take personal responsibility for their conduct. And so it's not everybody that needs to go to a therapist. It's not everybody that has perpetuated the abuse, because there are people who have been abused and they say, I will never do that to my kids, and they have done it. They live quietly with the little trauma in their head, but it has never acted out to the point of aggression or some form of psychological, mental, financial abuse. But it does happen. The majority of people do act it out. And so we need to start the conversation on it. We need people to see real faces to it, and we don't have to admit it to the rest of the world. Everybody doesn't have to come on national TV and talk about it. You just need to admit it to yourself first and start from there.
And I think we need to leave with some options for people, because I think in speaking about the issues of abuse, and we talked about being able to open the conversation amongst your own friends, family, whoever it is. But I also wanted to talk about something when I knew we were talking about the legal perspective. When we see people who are intoxicated and own a firearm, that is an offense.
Yes.
Yet we hear,
even if they have a license, it's an offense.
Even with a license, when somebody threatens to use their gun on you or touches it, that is an offense.
Yeah.
But we do not always use that. In other words, if I knew Isani has a gun and he's drunk and he's mad at his wife, and I do nothing, I have an option. I can call the police and say Isani is intoxicated and has a firearm on him. And perhaps I can prevent something as well. What I'm saying is there are interventions that are built in within the laws that we can take a step.
But people don't know the laws. And ignorance of the law is no defense. It is our duty to know these things, but some things are just common sense. You could know your inner fight and flight mechanism senses when there is danger. You could know that. And we need to be more proactive. We have to be, but like I keep going back to say, we are an abuse society. We have accept violence and abuse as part of our culture. So in those situations, many people don't recognize it because for them it's the norm. Which brings us to the topic that I had written about last time about in marriages. You have to look at it now in relationship, because in marriages, this is where you create a new family, and your same traumas now trickle down to your children, who then get married and trickle down to their children. And that's why it is a cycle. And when you peel my past, I could trace what happened to my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents and realize, hey, darn, I come from a cycle of abuse. But why do people stay in bad relationships? It's not because they're silly, it's not because they're bad or whatever, it's because they do not know how to break the cycle.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I had written about is in relationships, people do not realize that that constant nagging, that constant cheating and I forgive you, that constant quarrel, that constant withdrawal of affection, that constant that I will not buy groceries for the house because I'm upset with you, or that constant I will not put anything in the home unless you have sex with me, or I will not provide for our kids unless you have sex with me, that level of coercion, that in itself is abuse. And in family matrimonial law, it's called cruelty, persistent cruelty. And cruelty does not mean that they have to be beating you over your head. It's sometimes subtle, it's withdrawing affection. I mean, I talk to so many clients and they'll say, Miss, I've been married and stayed in that marriage, but for the past 5 years, my husband and I have no sexual interaction. Hello? In law, that's cruelty. So when that person, even with wives do it to husbands. So when you withdraw that affection, then that's a form of cruelty. And when that person then goes into the arms of someone else and you try to use it against them, the law says no. You cannot say that that adultery committed is a crime because you have connived or colluded or in some way accepted or condoned it by withdrawing, because marriage is about sex, whether you like it or not. Why beat someone if there's no intimacy? It is about sex, and sex is not bad. And that's another whole new topic because we live in a society where we are made to feel bad about our bodies. And so the reason I talk about these things openly is because I realize that if we do not develop healthy minds and healthy people, we'll never have a healthy country. We'll never be able to interact, govern ourselves properly, solve all the problems of crime. I mean, I know I'm all over the place because we're soon over, but another tidbit about this violence that I'm talking about and abuse. Could you imagine being a youth from the south side? You barely have anything to eat, your pa left, your ma have 5 picnic, every stepfather will come, that just one other abuser. And now you trying to get a little job or make ends meet, and every time you go, the police search you. That is a form of abuse against you because you've been profiled. So that anger from childhood is building up. And the system, the policing system, the governance system is already suppressing you a step farther. That person does become violent at some point, or different youths become violent at some point. And again, through my work, I've gotten to meet a lot of them and work with them. And what I find one trait similar with all of them, they all came from an abusive background. And so they feel that the way to survive is to fight and physically fight. And it's either I get you or you get me. So you find it easy to bring them into this gang activity because there's a sense of belonging, there's a sense of acceptance. And so they will act out eventually. And so thus the violence in the country. So it may not seem, some police don't want to see the correlation, but they're helping perpetuate the abuse. They're helping to perpetuate the crime. Because it's not as though they approach these young men with respect so that they could say, wow, I've been treated with respect. No, they treat them like a pig, a hog, a dog, like worse than animals. So when you do that, you are perpetuating the culture of abuse and violence in our country. When those young men retaliate, they're just acting out on a history of abuse they have. Think about it, a person that's happy and go-lucky, do you think they just pick up a gun one day and shoot someone? When you reach the point that you kill anyone, be it in a relationship or a fight on the street, that didn't happen overnight. You have a history of something that creates that propensity for you, and I'm telling you, it's abuse. We are a traumatized, abused society, and we don't want to talk about it because if we talk about it, we relive it. There was a time when I used to talk about how I grew up that I couldn't do it without crying. I could do it now without crying. I literally could tell you, I remember my dad beating me almost to a pulp, and after my skin is burst, he actually tells you have to put vinegar and salt in it. But that's how he grew up. That's what they did to him. He had to kneel on a grater. I don't know if you all know that grater. And you kneel there for hours. He would never send to school. He had to go fend for himself from a young age to find money to feed himself. So what do you think he would do to his children? I recognize that. So there was a time that there was a lot of pain and emotion that I felt that when I talk about it. So I didn't talk about it for a long time. But I'm beginning to come to terms with it. And I talk openly about it. People say, well, it must be hard. No, it's no longer hard. I can actually talk about it and share it because I recognize it for what it is. I can place it in the box where it should be. In the chapter of that film, think about a roll of film and you see the different slides. I can place it in the slide where it is. I recognize what it is. I name it for what it is. I no longer carry the shame.
And you're regaining control.
I no longer feel ashamed of it. I regain control and I recognize it for what it is. And it's beautiful. And I would love everybody to feel that sense of freedom and liberation. Anybody who has been
that is
it's a
after
one
the
has
point
to
of
follow.
actualization. And the actualization is really the harder part because...
But it's the most rewarding part.
But in our society where it is almost normalized, abuse is almost normalized in this. And I appreciate your example. It's from power abuse that we see to actual emotional and psychological abuse, and even the cases of physical and sexual abuse.
But we need to remedy it because these same young people will get into relationships. Either common law or marriage or visiting relationship. And if they don't have the proper dynamics, examples of what happened over the weekend will keep on happening, and some of them will not always end in death, but it ends in some real serious physical, emotional, sexual harm and scars that person carries through. And there needs to come a point when we stop it, and we have to individually try for ourselves, but societally we have a responsibility. This has to remain a topic, and it has to be something that you keep on dealing with it. A lot of people deal with it through their church. A lot of people have found healing through the church that they go to. A lot of people through the jobs they choose. A lot of people by leaving the country. A lot of people by supportive relationships they've gotten into, and I'm happy for that. But societally, as a collective group, we need to recognize it and name it for what it is, and make a better effort in our schools, in our churches, in our playgrounds, on our shows, in how we treat each other. Let's stop being flippant of how we cuss out by like, why the F wrong with you and my dog, and it's enforcing that power balance against another person.
Well, we want to say thank you for coming in this morning and starting what we hope is a conversation for today with people who've been watching, and to force us to take a bit of a reflection on our own lives and how we are perpetrators of violence as well. So thank you once again.
And how we respond to when people come to us with their problem.
All right. We got to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by representatives of Hand in Hand Ministries, so stay tuned.